Hi, do you recognize me? No, you won't, so permit me to start with an introduction. I am one of the servants in that wedding where water became wine, the best that you could ever taste. I am not a named character in the main account of this wonder story, but this narration gave me a voice, and this voice must be heard, because what I saw with my two eyes in that wedding, on that fateful day, I have not recovered from. So for the purpose of this story, you can call me Duma, a humble servant in this village, tasked with serving the people of Cana during their celebrations. I have seen many feasts, countless weddings, but none of them, not a single one, prepared me for what I witnessed that day, the day when water became wine. I've worked as a servant for many years now. The work is hard, and most times you're invisible to those you serve. We're not invited to the celebrations, though we spend hours preparing the feast and keeping it running smoothly. And so it was that day at the wedding in Cana. The bride and groom were from respected families, and the whole village had turned up for the celebration. The feast was one of the grandest I had ever seen. The music was lively, the food endless, and the wine was flowing like the waters of the Jordan. Laughter and joy filled the air as the guests danced and toasted to the happy couple. For a while, everything seemed perfect. But little did we know, the joy of the wedding would soon turn into quiet panic. It started with a quiet murmur. I was filling cups in the back of the courtyard when I saw the head servant's face drain of color. His eyes darted nervously around the crowd, and I knew something was wrong. He hissed, motioning me over. His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was terror in it. The wine is gone. At first, I didn't believe him. Gone? That couldn't be possible. This was a wedding. Running out of wine wasn't just a small inconvenience. It was an embarrassment, a public disaster. In our culture, the host's ability to provide for their guests was a matter of honor. To run out of wine at a wedding was the worst possible humiliation. We must find more, I stammered, though I knew the market was too far. There wasn't enough time. The guests would soon notice, and the shame would fall on the family. Fear gripped me. The joy of the wedding would evaporate, and in its place, there would be whispers. Whispers that would haunt the bride and groom for years. My hands trembled, and my heart raced as I thought of the coming storm. The celebration would soon crumble, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. It was then that I noticed her, a woman, serene amidst the rising panic. Her steps calm as she approached a man, who I later came to realize was her son, whose name was Jesus, a man whose carriage, aura, and demeanor spoke so much confidence and gentleness. I didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't part of the wedding party, just another guest, but something about him made me pause. I edged closer, my curiosity piqued. "They have no more wine," she said to him, her voice low but clear. It was not a plea, but a simple statement. Jesus looked at her, his expression soft but thoughtful. "Woman, why do you involve me?" he asked. "My hour has not yet come." There was no argument, no hesitation from the woman. She turned to us, the servants, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence. "Do whatever he tells you," she said. I was bewildered. How could this guest, this Jesus, possibly solve our crisis? But something in her voice commanded respect. Despite my confusion, I nodded. There was nothing else we could do. Jesus stood, his gaze sweeping over the courtyard. He didn't seem hurried or concerned, but instead focused on something that the rest of us couldn't see. His eyes fell on 6 large stone jars, standing off to the side. They were used for ceremonial washing, holding gallons of water for purification purposes. What could he possibly want with those? "Fill the jars with water," Jesus said, his voice calm and steady. I stared at him, utterly confused. Water? The guests didn't want water, they wanted wine. And filling the jars would take time and effort. It seemed a pointless task. But still, there was something in his tone, something that compelled me to obey. The other servants and I hurried to the well, filling jug after jug and hauling the water back to the jars. Sweat trickled down my back as I lugged the heavy jugs. Each jar was large enough to hold 20 or 30 gallons. and by the time we filled the last one, my muscles were burning and my clothes were damp with sweat. We stood there, staring at the jars, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing. The jars were filled with water, just as they had been before. I could feel the weight of dread building in my chest. Was this some kind of cruel joke? I glanced nervously at the other servants. They looked as bewildered as I felt. What was Jesus trying to do? My stomach churned with unease. What would happen if we served water to the guests? They would be furious. The head servant would surely lose his job. Perhaps we all would. Jesus spoke again, his voice cutting through my anxious thoughts. Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. My heart skipped a beat. My hands began to tremble. Serve this to the master? The man who was responsible for overseeing the feast? The thought made my head spin. There was no way we could offer him water. The embarrassment, the shame, it would be unbearable. But there was something in Jesus' eyes, something that made me trust him despite my doubts. I couldn't explain it. My hands shook as I reached for a cup and dipped it into one of the jars. I half expected the water to turn into wine as it filled the cup, but no, it was still water. Clear as day. I swallowed hard. This was madness. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as I walked toward the master of the banquet. My steps felt heavy, as if each one carried the weight of the entire wedding on my shoulders. The master of the banquet stood at the head of the feast, his back turned to me as he spoke with another guest. I felt the eyes of the other servants on me, their silent prayers mingling with my own. My palms were slick with sweat as I held the cup in my hands. With every step, I imagined the disaster that was about to unfold. I reached him and stood there, paralyzed for a moment. I couldn't do it. How could I serve him this? It was water, plain water. The guests would laugh, they would talk, the shame would be unbearable. But there was no turning back now. I cleared my throat softly and handed him the cup, my hands trembling as they extended it. The master barely glanced at me, distracted by the conversation he was having. He took the cup, raised it to his lips, and he paused. I felt my breath catch in my throat. He lowered the cup slightly and looked at it, puzzled. My heart pounded in my chest. Had he noticed? Was this the moment when everything fell apart? I was sure he had realized that something was wrong. My stomach churned with dread, and I braced myself for the inevitable scolding. The master held the cup closer, inspecting it. The moments stretched into what felt like an eternity. Time seemed to slow as I stood there, paralyzed with fear. I felt the heat rise to my face and my hands grew cold. I was certain that my fate was sealed, that he would expose the truth any second now. Then, as if by some unseen force, the water changed. One moment it was clear, and the next it was wine, rich, deep red wine. I blinked in disbelief. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It was impossible. I had carried water to the master of the banquet. I was sure of it. But here, in his hands, was the finest color of wine I had ever seen. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what my eyes had just witnessed. Had it really happened? Had the water turned to wine right before my eyes? I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, and yet I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The master of the banquet, unaware of the miracle that had just taken place, took a sip of the wine. His eyes widened in surprise. He turned quickly, searching for the bridegroom. "Bring the bridegroom," the master called, his voice booming with excitement. The guests turned to watch as the bridegroom approached, confusion written across his face. My heart sank. I was sure the worst was about to happen. Had the wine turned bad? Had we made a mistake? I felt the blood drain from my face as the bridegroom arrived at the master's side. The master grinned, raising the cup for all to see. "Everyone brings out the choice wine first," he said, loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear, "and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." I nearly collapsed with relief. The tension that had gripped my chest loosened, and I could feel my legs trembling beneath me. The best wine. He had called it the best wine. I glanced over at the other servants, their faces a mix of disbelief and wonder. The celebration continued, even more joyous than before. The guests raised their cups in laughter, unaware of the miracle they were drinking. I stood near the stone jars, my heart still pounding in my chest, still trembling with the weight of what I had just witnessed. The other servants gathered near me, their whispers barely audible over the laughter of the guests. We had all seen it. Water had filled the jars, yet somehow, here we were, watching the guests enjoy the finest wine. I still couldn't understand it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the miracle that had just taken place. Moments ago, we had faced disaster. The wine had run out, and with it, the joy of the celebration would have withered into shame. But now, as the guests clinked their cups and the bridegroom basked in the praise of the master of the banquet, it was as if none of it had happened. The joy had been restored, and the wedding would be remembered, not for its failure, but for the abundance of the best wine. I glanced back at the jars, the massive stone vessels that had once held water. They were now empty, but they had been the vessels of something far greater than any of us could have imagined. My hands still shook as I wiped them on my apron, trying to calm my racing heart. I had been part of something divine, something miraculous, yet it had happened so quietly, so humbly. No one else, aside from the servants and perhaps Jesus' mother, knew what had truly taken place. The guests laughed and toasted, completely unaware that just moments before, they had been on the brink of drinking water in place of wine. And now, they were enjoying the best wine of the night, wine that hadn't existed just minutes before. I felt a sense of awe settle over me, a quiet wonder that left me breathless. How could this be? How could something so impossible happen before my very eyes? I had seen the water. I had carried it in my hands. And yet, here we were. I glanced at Jesus, standing quietly near his mother. He didn't seem concerned. He wasn't boasting, wasn't drawing attention to himself. He simply watched the celebration unfold, a calm smile on his face. He wasn't moved, he wasn't jumping around, and somehow that terrified me. He knew what he had done, and he was so calm about it. He hadn't performed it for recognition or applause. He hadn't done it to show off his power. He had done it quietly, humbly, out of compassion for the family. He had seen their need and he had met it, without fanfare, without attention. As I stood there reflecting on the events of the day, I realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen in the quiet moments, in the simple acts of faith and obedience. We had followed Jesus' instructions, even when they didn't make sense. And in doing so, we had witnessed something extraordinary. The jars had been filled with water, yet when the master of the banquet drank from them, they had been transformed into the finest wine. It was a reminder that even the most ordinary things, water, jars, servants, can become vessels of the divine when placed in the hands of someone like Jesus.